and they basically were worried that there was going to be some sort of new, marijuana weed cheese that would harm the Cougar Gold and the Ferdinand's ice cream that they produce there.
Hi, I'm Scott Leadingham. Thanks for joining us here in the unique Northwest. Today we are with Jacob Jones, founder and editor of the news website Whitman County Watch. Thanks for joining us today, Jacob.
Thanks for having me.
So Jacob's going to be telling us about some of the happenings going on around the Palouse region and some of the things he's been reporting on. First, Jacob, this issue with a police officer, former police officer for the city of Pullman, who now stands charged with custodial sexual misconduct. The jury just selected, trials getting underway. Tell us more about the background with the case of Daniel Hargraves.
Sure. So back in April of 2018, a young woman, an 18-year-old WSU freshman, came forward alleging that an officer had basically coerced her into performing a sex act to avoid getting arrested for alleged underage drinking. That investigation turned out that she had contact with a couple of different local officers, and they later focused on former Sergeant Dan Hargraves and went through all of the evidence of that night as far as his body camera footage, what incidences he had responded to, cell phone data from the woman, and other factors, and eventually they were able to match DNA from her clothing to DNA samples that they took from the sergeant.
And then he eventually he left the force. He basically resigned right before he was arrested, and now that was several months ago.
Right, back in last fall, the internal investigation was going to interview him, and he decided to resign basically in lieu of termination, and was arrested shortly after that on his felony warrant.
You've written about this case and others involving disciplinary issues for the city of Pullman and its police department and other police departments in the region. And a lot of that depends on the use of public records and robust public records laws. Washington has a pretty good one for journalists and private citizens to request records and do digging. I'm just curious, how much of your work really depends on those public records, and is it not possible to do your work without them, or is it just something that enhances your work, but otherwise you'd still be able to do what you do?
Sure. In a lot of ways, public records are pretty foundational for the type of reporting that I do, that sort of government transparency. A lot of it is looking at accountability issues. Those records are often documents that reflect either internal issues that government's been struggling with, or disciplinary matters, the types of things that agencies aren't probably going to put out a press release about. They're not going to announce, and so while they might be doing some of that work to handle things behind the scenes, without public records, a lot of that information would never come to light as far as what citizens know about how the government operates.
Well, speaking of some of your stories, you've recently reported on the issue of marijuana regulation. Of course, we know that Washington state voters passed legalized marijuana in 2012. However, there's a lot of leeway for counties to have regulation within that, whether they allow businesses or how many business licenses, growers, those sorts of things. And so you've recently reported on some of the issues that have come up, particularly in southeastern Washington and Whitman County, but it applies in other areas as well. Basically, how rural counties are treating marijuana regulation. Tell us a little bit about what you've reported on.
Right, like you said, as the regulations on marijuana have kind of evolved over the last few years, as the state's been figuring it out, a lot of eastern Washington counties or cities have decided that they want to impose stricter rules on growers or processors than what the state requires. The AG's office for the state has basically determined that there is no right to operate a marijuana business. You can operate a marijuana business, but if local governments want to completely shut that down, they can. So there's an interesting conflict between these sort of rural agriculture-based economies that could be looking at marijuana as sort of this new cash crop, but having sort of a clash of culture against sort of family values and some of the traditional concerns about marijuana usage.
I was surprised to learn in some of your reporting that Washington State University, on whose campus we currently are, we should note that, was was in favor of retaining a moratorium in Whitman County, if I said that correctly. So they were basically wanting to keep some stricter regulation on marijuana businesses in the county. And the university itself does a lot of research, or is trying to do research. Its own researchers and scientists are doing study on marijuana, and they've run into issues at the federal level getting access to marijuana to be grown and then used for their own research. But WSU was trying to basically support the moratoriums going on in Whitman County. That was an interesting kind of interplay there. What was their reasoning there?
Right. So the Whitman County just finished its first sort of 6-month moratorium on things, and that was sparked by a business, Selway Holdings, that wanted to put in a new processing facility south of Pullman that coincidentally would have been right next to the WSU dairy. So some of the folks in the dairy program and the rest of the sort of agricultural research program came forward with these concerns that somehow the marijuana grow might have aerosolized particles that could contaminate the feed at the dairy facility, or somehow contaminate the milk supply. And they basically were worried that there was going to be some sort of new, marijuana weed cheese that would harm the Cougar Gold and the Ferdinand's ice cream that they produce there.
So on another story that you've done involving controlled substances, opioids, of course, and the painkillers that are produced from them are a topic of much reporting nationally. And of course, how they're handled by regulators and pharmaceutical companies has been of great interest lately. You did some reporting over the summer involving basically how many opioid painkillers, legal ones, are coming through pharmacies in the region, especially one in Colfax, a relatively small town, fewer than 3,000 people, and millions. I think it was about 3.3 million pills into this one pharmacy in Colfax over the course of less than 10 years, 2006 to 2013, when the data is available. That seemed very striking, but tell us a little bit more, dig into the data there for us. How did you find that information? First of all, that seems like it'd be hard to get. And also, two, what is that really saying about what's going on in Whitman County?
Sure. So it was pretty easy data for me to get, but it was extremely hard for the Washington Post and the local newspapers that kind of went to bat for that data to get their hands on it. It's data that was originally collected and maintained by the Drug Enforcement Administration. The Washington Post and some local papers, fought to get that released as part of the ongoing Purdue Pharma opioid lawsuit that's going on, and so those newspapers made that data available nationwide. So that's what my local reporting is based on, is that data set. And I would note that as part of the overall opioid crisis, this is a pretty small window into that. The latest data is from 2012. And again, a lot of opioid issues stem from either stolen pills or from heroin abuse, that kind of thing. But I do think that as sort of the crisis was sort of peaking, it shows just the volume of pills that were going through rural and small towns. Whitman County only has about a dozen pharmacies, and almost half of the pills went out through this Colfax pharmacy. The owner of that pharmacy says that they serve a large area of the county. They have a lot of rural people that come in to get their prescriptions filled there. They have an aging population. They have a population that does a lot of manual labor, farm work, things that might lead them to having higher rates of opioid prescriptions. So I think it's an interesting sort of insight into the overall problem. Certainly doesn't tell the whole story, but as we all kind of grapple with this crisis, it's nice to get our arms around some of it.
And so first of all, we should be clear, you weren't alleging any sort of impropriety or something illegal or illicit going on through this pharmacy.
No, certainly not. It was all just sort of a look with the information that was available about what areas kind of saw what levels of these pills being distributed.
And though, how does it compare to, you said there's about a dozen pharmacies, and this was vastly outweighed, maybe by proportion, other pharmacies in the comparatively. Is that what you're saying?
Right. In that same time period of 06 to 2012, more pills went out through that Colfax pharmacy than the 8 pharmacies combined in the Pullman area, so the largest city in the county. The second largest pharmacy by distribution was also another small rural town pharmacy up in St. John. So I think there is an argument that being sort of remote and having a large sort of rural base of customers can inflate the numbers going through your pharmacy.
Well, it's interesting reporting, and we appreciate you bringing it to our attention. Thank you so much, Jacob, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Jacob Jones is the editor and founder of the news website Whitman County Watch. If you want to support that or find out more of what he's reporting on, you can look at it at whitmancountywatch.com. And more news of the Northwest on our website is at nwpb.org. Thank you for joining us here in the unique Northwest.